This week I'm joined by Lingling Wei. She writes for the Wall Street Journal, and she's an award-winning journalist in the journal's Beijing bureau. She's the co-author of this new book, Superpower Showdown, how the battle between Trump and Xi threatens a new Cold War. So in the first chapter, we learn a bit about you personally. You come from a Chinese military family, but can you elaborate a little bit more on that and how your experiences give you a unique perspective on the US-China relations?
Sure. Thank you very much, Ryan. Pleasure to be here with you. One of the most amazing experiences about writing this book is that both Bob and I, Bob is my co-author, got to tell a little bit of our personal, stories and family histories, because in a very small but remarkable kind of way, our own family stories kind of mirrored the ups and downs of the broader US-China relationship. As you just pointed out, I was born into a Chinese military family in the late 70s. I think, through much of my childhood, I was raised in an environment where my parents and the elderly in the family very much emphasized disciplines, academic achievements, all those very, Chinese kind of upbringing. So the way I looked at myself and my career trajectory was, I'm among the younger Chinese generation that has significantly benefited from China's economic rise and integration with the rest of the world, especially the United States. When I went to college in the 90s, I went to Shanghai's Fudan University. Back then was considered one of the more liberal kind of Lingling universities in China. So I was exposed to a lot of American literature, and journalism, journalists' work and all that. I just remembered, the kind of classes I loved to attend when I was in college was always the ones taught by Fulbright scholars. That's how I learned about Bob Woodward, Karen Bernstein, Watergate scandal, how they uncovered it. So it was back then I started to develop this interest in knowing, basically venturing out my own comfort zone and having opportunity to go maybe to the United States someday to get a better understanding of what journalism was really about. So I really benefited from China's integration with the rest of the world. As you probably know, that back in the late 90s and throughout the 90s, actually, a lot of young Chinese got opportunities to study in the US, and many of them have stayed in the country. And I was among one of them. The year I went to New York was 99. I got a full scholarship to a brand new business journalism program at New York University. Super excited, just, felt like, wow, just a new beginning for myself. Then something very unexpected happened, which we also mentioned in the book, was the US bombing of Chinese embassy in Belgrade. Obviously that incident stirred up a lot of anti-American sentiment in China. There were like protests on probably daily basis outside the US embassy in Beijing and the consulate in Shanghai at the time I was in Shanghai. So I was really kind of questioning my decision to go to the US at the time. I tried so hard to get a scholarship, but then this happened. Should I still go to a country where, its bombers kind of killed our fellow countrymen? So it was really, it really started to make me question. I knew at the bottom of my heart, I still wanted to go. And I really wanted to believe the American reasoning that that was an accident. It was, a mistake, not intentional. So anyway, so I went to this mentor of mine, who also editor at a Chinese a state-owned newspaper. And the only thing he said was, just go. This is your future. Just go. So anyway, so I packed up and went to New York and uh, studied journalism and also got a job after I graduated from NYU. So, but I was very lucky. I was able to land a job with Dow Jones, that Newswire, so it's a sister company to the Journal at the time. So anyway, so along the way, I was able to move from reporting for the wire service to writing for the Wall Street Journal. But I always wanted to come back to China, because that was really my dream job, practicing independent journalism, writing about China for a global audience while in China. So I became an American citizen in late 2010. That basically allowed me to go back to China as a journalist for the Wall Street Journal. But, over the past 10 years, I mostly focused on covering China's economic policies, the intersection between the politics and the economy. And Bob and I have been cooperating in terms of coverage of the trade relationship ever since late 2017. So anyway, so we just been documenting the saga every step of the way, without knowing that one day we ourselves would become part of the story. That was early this year, around March. Most American journalists for the Journal, the New York Times, and Post basically were kicked out by the Chinese government as part of the retaliation against Washington's earlier decision to cap the number of Chinese journalists working in the US. So I became, even though, I am ethnic Chinese and this family background, I became like a collateral damage from this political crossfire. So now I'm back in New York. I will continue to write about China. It was really heartbreaking for me to have to leave China. But on the other hand, it also has enriched my personal life experience. Like, not only we're covering this, we're actually experiencing this every step of the way. So I think that really helped us tell this broader US-China relationship from a more nuanced and and probably give it a personal touch also to this story.
So there's lots of phrases to describe the moment that the US and China are living through. So there's like geoeconomics,
Right.
weaponized interdependence, and there's like Professor Graham Allison, he calls it falling into the Thucydides' trap. Now, is it fair to say that we are in Cold War II?
I think it's fair. By the time when we wrote the book, the subhead is how the battle between Trump and Xi threatens a new Cold War. Today, I think we are at least 5 inches in. The signs are pretty obvious by now. For example, the latest speech by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo just a couple of weeks ago, he basically called for the U.S. allies to stand up against the Communist Party leadership in China. And most recent actions the U.S. Trump administration taken against big Chinese tech giants, TikTok. The latest news involved WeChat, and also, broadly speaking, we continuing to see journalists uh, in both countries continue to get kicked out. So and this emphasis from both sides on ideological battle also is taking shape. For in China, for quite a while now, President Xi Jinping really has focused on this ideological purity, right? Making sure that the party ideology and the influence in party really moving back to the center of Chinese people's lives. And back in the US, you're starting to hear more and more US officials basically trying to make a distinction between Chinese people and the ruling Chinese Communist Party. In the past, the uh, American officials just broadly referred to China, right? Chinese government. And nowadays, from Pompeo, from all the other senior officials, more and more you're hearing them singling out CCP, CCP this, CCP that, and just very clear that they're aiming at the communist ideology as well. So that is really taking shape, and it's very similar to the first version of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union.
And do you think this tension's been driven by individuals? So Xi Jinping, Donald Trump, Robert Lighthizer, or even John Bolton earlier on? Or do you think that it's something structural? Do you think this was inevitable as a rising power that's going to challenge the hegemon?
That's a very good question. Many people think that it is inevitable that the two countries will have such a clash because some people in China think the U.S. would just pick on anyone that is threatening the U.S. dominance as the world leader, number one. And there are people in the U.S. who hold similar views as well. I would also characterize that this is a fight, fundamentally is a fight between two very different systems. So, as we just talked about earlier, Western type of democracy versus this authoritarian system in China. What really makes things complicated these days is it seems like, in some ways, this authoritarian system doesn't look that bad, right? So the Chinese government, yes, they mishandled the coronavirus pandemic when it first happened, right? Covered it up, was slow to act, alert the public. But later on, they were able to keep things under control with very draconian measures. So, and also the Chinese, some people say the Chinese economy so far also has survived this multi-year trade war with the US. And when it comes to Hong Kong, they pushed through this massive, basically bill aimed at cracking down civil liberty in Hong Kong. It's that it seems like they have done all those things, and the regime is still there, and the top leadership, by some measures, even is enjoying a genuine sense of support from the Chinese public. On the other hand, when you look at Western democracies, including the US, the pandemic really is getting out of control. And for a country with so much power and so advanced medical and all systems, and actually have most number of people that got infected by the disease. So, that really complicates the fight a little bit. Like on one hand, you probably want to make sure the people in the opponent country could also be on your side. You know, you need pressure from within to help make certain changes, but that's not happening right now. If anything, the you know, also of course that's partly thanks to the very tight censorship of what people can read and see within China. But right now, the Chinese people, when they look at the other side, their thinking is, you know what, democracy is really not, you know, what it seems. And, you know, our system, it just works. And, you know, why should we be more like America? So you're just really seeing that kind of dynamic playing out in China these days. And that really is further feeding into the hands of the more, you know, hawkish forces in the country.
And how did we reach this point? Because in 2006, Neil Ferguson famously coined the term Chimerica, and there was one stage in which the two nations were saying they were like a married couple. So when did this tension begin? How did we reach it?
Sure. The first turning point is the 2008 global financial crisis. We had a very detailed passage about that era. So that during that time, you know, President George W. Bush, he would call President Hu Jintao twice in 1 month, basically asking the Chinese leader to come help him, right? You should also do big stimulus, you know, help the economy, global economy. Come to Washington, join me. So, you know, the table has totally turned. The US was in trouble. The financial system, the whole Western financial system was at the brink of collapse. And China, you know, their economy was humming, right? So that whole experience just convinced the Chinese leadership that our model works. And not only that, we can help you, right? The times when the American economic system was the one for China to emulate, those days were over. So that really became to became a very big confidence booster for the Chinese leadership, and also opened the door for Beijing to become more assertive on the world stage. You know, not just economically, but geopolitically, you know, militarily, technologically, especially under Xi Jinping, we see that he has used this whole China dream agenda to really push for a more hawkish, this more kind of, you know, nationalistic policy, a policy agenda, which really centers on, you know, make China this great superpower that is on par with the US.
And of course, President Trump and John Bolton are responsible for the most serious trade war since the 30s. Now, how damaging has it been for relations? How has it affected China, and how has it affected the US?
The trade war? Sure. You know, for China, the damage definitely is much more severe than the leadership has been willing to admit. There are two major damages that are probably hard to quantify. One is the confidence, especially from uh, investors and private businesses. You know, as you know, China's rise over the past 40 years has been largely filled by entrepreneurs, right? They, even though this has a very strong emphasis on making the state sector bigger, stronger, and better, it is really the private sector that has employed most number of workers and generate most uh, 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 the biggest share of productivity growth. But the trade war, you know, kind of uh, brought about so much uncertainty over China's future. You know, China, it does look like now China can no longer benefit from a stable relationship with the US or with the outside world. So that's a huge uncertainty for businesses when they think about expanding plants or not, hiring more workers or not, ramping up production or not. So that is one damage that, the damage to confidence that's really hard to quantify, but could really be long lasting and severe. The other damage I would say is any momentum to carry out market-oriented reforms. So in the past, especially during the era of Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji, when they pushed through China's entry into the WTO, foreign pressure was good for reforms in China. It was considered, another lever top officials could use to basically shake up the very cumbersome state sector. Not anymore. Under Xi Jinping, foreign pressure is something that the Chinese have to stand up against. It actually made a lot of market-oriented and liberal type of thinkers in China initially really hoped the trade offensive could pave the way or motivate some bigger changes to the economic system in China. For example, things the US asked for, structural reform involving industrial subsidies, SOE reform, those things ultimately would be good for the China's economy in the long run. But because the heavy pressure from the US, this pressure technique, it's not working anymore. And any reform-minded official these days, even if they still think that's the right thing to do, they're not willing or doesn't dare to speak up, anymore. Because if they, kind of advocate those policy changes, they would be viewed as a traitor, right? Kowtowing to the pressure from the US. So that's another big cost of this trade war, which is any kind of momentum to carry out big reforms in China.
So let's go back to the 1990s when China joins the WTO. Now, it's well documented that American intentions were that China would adopt liberal reforms politically. Now, and that's obviously turned out to be false now. But do you think their optimism was actually quite well informed back then, and events have transpired in a way that that's obviously not made it the case? But do you think it's the case that in the 1990s China was capable of liberal reforms or not?
You mean politically speaking?
Yeah.
Right. So the Chinese, I do not believe any senior Chinese leader intentionally left the impression that, you guys allow us in, we would be more like you politically years down the road. I really don't think that's ever happened. However, I'm sure basically the exchanges between the US and Chinese official back then was more like, as Premier Zhu Rongji said publicly, if you allowed us in to this global trading system, we would have to abide by your rules. That means our economy would be, more and more like yours, or, we would have to make some adjustments to our economic model so that, we can be operate in a system that, economically speaking, more in line with this global model. So, but on the other hand, Chinese officials, the ruling elites, at least, they never really, they don't really see the contradiction between promoting a market economy and strengthening or maintaining the party's rule over the country. They think they can accomplish both. Deng Xiaoping did that. Jiang Zemin did that. Hu Jintao did that. Xi Jinping, even more so, is emphasizing that. when those two forces contradict with each other, obviously, you know what she would pick, right? Party control trumps everything else. So, you know, whatever they're doing these days, the overarching agenda is to make sure that a party's rule of the country is being strengthened, not weakened by any in any way.
So the book begins in December 2018, and you begin with John Bolton accusing China of stealing intellectual property, and he adopts a really hawkish line. So what happens in December 2018?
December 2018. So that was, I think that was a Wall Street Journal CEO Council meeting that we featured in the introduction of the book, right? So my partner Bob was at the conference that day. So what really struck him at the time was, you know, so many CEOs who traditionally the strongest lobbyist, right, advocate for the Chinese government. So many of them actually would believe that the two countries would be headed for a shooting war. That was quite extraordinary, right? Considering years of engagement. The Chinese, US companies spent a quarter century building up a global supply chain that prominently featured China's market. And now they were actually expecting the chances of a shooting war rising. So that really struck us as a very good way to illustrate how much has changed for both countries.
And chapter 19 is called Negotiating a Truce, and it documents the period from December 2019 to the start of 2020. So what happens in that period just before the coronavirus emerges on the scene?
Sure. So that was the last leg of the trade negotiations that ultimately led to the signing in January of the phase one trade agreement. Obviously, at that point of time, both sides had very strong incentives to actually, let's call a truce on this. For the US, President Trump was, you know, preparing for the upcoming presidential election, you know, in the coming year. He needed the markets to keep rising, U.S. economy, you know, keeps growing, right? That's basically, you know, the one of the key factors that would decide whether or not he would win the election or not. So from the Chinese side, they also wanted to have a truce. One of the main reasons was obviously they're pushing forward already back then. They were in the process of drafting the national security law on Hong Kong, right? Because they wanted to restore stability. For the ruling party, nothing matters more than sovereignty issues, right? So, you know, one part of their calculation is such that, you know, for Trump, everything's on the table, everything can be negotiated. So if the Chinese can use this trade agreement as additional leverage, that so that the US wouldn't push too hard on issues that matter to the Chinese government too much, then that would be considered a tactical win for the Chinese side. So that really helped explain why China committed to a trade deal that, you know, really didn't look realistic even back then, even more so these days, right? So I think that's what really happened in both capitals in terms of trying to get a deal done.
We've seen a lot of rhetoric since the coronavirus came into the West, and obviously Trump's called it the Chinese virus. Now, how serious is this rhetoric, and what does it mean for Cold War II?
Sure. Coronavirus pandemic further deepened the mistrust on both countries toward each other. You know, because what makes this really complicated is that still to this day, we do not know for sure how it got started. And there are many theories, some of them conspiracy theories, you know, being bandied about by both sides. But really, there's no scientific answer, or most authoritative answer so far. So that really, you know, has caused a lot of finger pointing at you know, from both sides at each other. And another thing is that it dramatically changed the political dynamic in Washington, right? So before the pandemic, the chances of President Trump getting reelected probably were very high, right? And now you look at the polls, he's actually trailing the Democratic candidate Biden. So obviously he's very angry at China. You know, had not been for what he called China virus, he probably could have won the re-election very easily. But now he's actually struggling to compete with Biden. So you can tell the anger that's coming out of Washington at China, and that really reinforced the hands of more hawkish forces in Washington. I think that really helped explain why there seems to be this never-ending daily actions or sanctions aimed at Chinese companies, Chinese officials, or you know, really tough talks on China. From China's perspective, the pandemic really has hurt the Chinese economy. They were at the beginning of the year, the Chinese leaders were talking about this year GDP growing at about 6%. So that would help the leadership realize one of the 100-year goals, which is doubling the size of the economy from the 2010 level. But now they're struggling to get people employed, factory, you know, operating, and having to deal with slumping demand from overseas. So it just, this enormous pressure, economic pressure, you know, make it really a tricky situation for the Chinese leadership now, because they have to keep people employed in order to maintain stability. So it really, it's a very complicated situation for them as well, because on one hand, they cannot be seen as backing down in this fight with the US. On the other hand, they also realize if they push back too hard, that could have greater economic consequences for economy that's already slowing sharply. So they have to walk very, you know, on this very tight rope, trying to balance all those different needs. You know, how do we make sure that we really do not go into a shooting war with the US, but also, you know, being able to draw the lines along the issues that we care about most. This is a very tough situation for sure. I believe the next 90 days until the US election will be really, really crucial. If anything bad happens, it might happen during the next 90 days. But if both sides still maintain some kind of sanity, you know, that maintain the status quo, that would be the best outcome.
And let's say Biden does get elected. Do you see a similar line being pursued on China, or do you think it'll moderate slightly?
I think at least the tone will be better. That's what, you know, if you talk to Chinese officials these days, that's what they would tell you too. They're hoping at least, you know, Biden wouldn't be so belligerent almost on a daily basis. Terms such as China virus probably would be gone. And Biden also might try to go back to those multilateral organizations. You know, after all, U.S. still needs China on a number of issues like climate change, change, environmental issues, and other, broader kind of geopolitical issues, both sides, there's still room for talks and negotiations and dialogues. So that's what the Chinese side is hoping for.
And as Sino-American relations deteriorate, how do you think Europe and the EU is going to respond?
I think a lot of European countries, including UK, probably getting caught in the middle right now, right? You have, you're there. I'm sure you have much sharper insights about that than I do. Obviously, what we saw during the 2 years of trade war was the US really went on this by itself, right? It didn't really try to work with allies to address concerns that also are shared by the US allies, things like industrial subsidies and IP theft and those kind of things. Instead, it went alone on this battle with China. And the Chinese side tried to capitalize on that, right? You see President Xi Jinping telling European executives that if one door closes, another opens, meaning if your country is not in a geopolitical fight with us, your companies would get more business opportunities in China's markets. So it's a kind of a blend of threat and outright threat and some enticements, right? To trying to get the European countries, a lot of them, to pick sides. So I think, this really, this deteriorating bilateral relationship between the US and China really is putting a lot of European countries in the middle. But after all, I think it just really, for policymakers, you just still really need to think hard, right? There's if your companies and your people still want to go to China, either do business or live and work and get this Chinese experience, I think just have to find a way to engage with the regime, like it or not. Personally, I think it's more dangerous if just completely cutting the ties, as if we don't deal with each other anymore. It's, after all, it's like we're talking about the country that's already the world's second largest economy. Just really, really hard to cut it out from your daily lives and conversations. So let's hope cooler heads will prevail all over the world, not just in US, in China, in Europe too. Like find a way that we can both, address the issues, the really serious issues, but also keep engagement going, but in a more effective way. I know it's super hard said than done, and that's why real kind of leadership matters more in today's world than any point of time.
And in terms of Cold War One, of course, it didn't remain a Cold War across the world. It did between the Soviet Union and the US, but across other parts of the world, there were hot wars. So do you think this will remain a Cold War, or do you think a collision in the South China Sea, for example, would trigger a hot war?
I still think outright big gunfight, the chances for that happening is low. After all, you're talking about two nuclear nations, and the consequences unimaginable. But would there be frictions, regional frictions? That obviously that's really hard to say for sure as well, but there are definitely risks of that. So let's see what really, one encouraging sign that we saw in the past week was there's a phone conversation, obviously, between the defense ministers in both China and the US. And by the official readout, it does seem like they both wanted to avoid any kind of military conflicts. Well, let's hope they keep their words and just really try make some efforts to avoid that kind of thing from happening.
Okay, appreciate you're really busy, so I'll just keep you for one more question if that's all right.
Sure.
What needs to be done, do you think, to escape this situation, or do you think it's the case that US-China relations are beyond repair?
I think we're already past the point where that everything could just go back to normal. Um, it takes, when you talk to Chinese officials, they always say the ball is in the US court. Actually, not. That's not correct. The ball is in both countries' court. And, for now, I really do not think they're going to do anything to either provoke the situation further or actively addressing core concerns from the US side because of the upcoming election. I think they're trying to wait it out and see what happens after November 3rd. Then after that, I really sincerely hope that both sides can just tone down maybe the rhetoric a little bit and try to go back to the negotiation table and lay things out. Right? What are the issues that need to be addressed and how to address them? One thing is that what is the end game here, right? What is it that the US trying to do? I mean, is it regime change, or is it let's go back to the fundamental trade imbalances the Trump administration talked about earlier when they started the trade offensive, which involved a lot of structural issues. Maybe those things we can start the talks again about how to address those issues. I think really right now I'm not seeing any motivation from either side to address those deeper issues. And for the Chinese side, they definitely are waiting things out and see what happens after November 3rd.
Okay, Lingling Wei, thanks for your time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.